Welcome to the next Techzine on Tour. Today we're talking to one of the guests that I really hoped to get into this program, and this is Reilly, the CTO and Vice President of Citrix.
Thank you.
Let's start with an easy one.
It's always a good place.
Yeah, how is it going at Citrix? How are you guys performing?
I think it's going very well. You know, we set out our both our business strategy, our financial strategy, and of course the product and services strategy. It's going great. You know, I think our public results from a financial perspective are good. A lot of energy around the show here, and I think you know, being able to unveil things like the intelligent experience with Citrix Workspace is really helping us build on the message from last year. And you know, the feedback I've got from people around the show is that everybody kind of likes the direction. So all in all, we're very excited, Koen.
Yeah, if we look a bit back a few years, then Citrix was kind of looking for their position in the market and where they were really going. Is it fair to say that you now have a clear path and a clear strategy, and you're really aiming for that workspace and maybe the unified workspace?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at the transition from being a kind of an on-premises software company to being a cloud services company, I think it really forces you to kind of rethink what it is that you want to offer, right? So I think if you look at what we're doing now within workspaces, within networking, and within analytics, you can pretty much put everything that we do in those three areas. And of course, there's a lot underneath that, and lots of different features, capabilities underneath each one of those. But I think the cohesive nature of that, tied to our sort of continued message around experience, choice, security, I think it's I think it's fair to say that we've gone through a lot of transition, but I think the strategy's solid and it seems to be resonating in the market. And so I mean, I think it's a natural progression as all technologies ultimately move to cloud, or certainly a significant number of them. I think it was very wise of us to position the way we've done, continue to deliver on that strategy, and we're seeing lots of good uptake from customers. Long way to go, of course. I mean, we shouldn't think that we're done by any means, but I mean, I think it's very clear where we're heading, what we're trying to do. I think the keynote is certainly built on last year, reinforced a lot of the core messages, and hopefully it resonates with everybody.
Did it also change the way you work at Citrix or your colleagues in the last couple of years, or?
Yeah, oh, absolutely, of course. Yeah, I mean, there's from the CTO office perspective, there's a lot of things that we do, both with the product and engineering teams, but of course with the field, and the field is a big change for those guys in general, from sort of going selling individual products, which has been the lifeblood of the company, to turning that into solution selling. And of course the experience that some of my guys have on the customer side and then coming over into the vendor side is extremely valuable to help bring the message to customers, but also to be advocates. We have to understand the customer journey, make sure that we're aligned with their direction and providing the right products and services at the right time to help them on the journey. So yeah, absolutely, it's a huge change. I mean, I think the whole of the company changes from the engineering and product teams right the way down to the marketing teams to the enablement teams and ultimately the sellers, and it's kind of one big team, so there's no kind of individual departments. It's and we're going to do what's right for the customers ultimately. So that includes the partnerships that we have, the things that we announced this week with Microsoft, with Google, VMware. I mean, it's a massive space, and our partners are also key. So yeah, there's lots of moving parts, and it does change. Absolutely, it does change.
Yeah, you partnered with Google, Microsoft, and even with VMware now. How do you look at competition? Because VMware was kind of competition for you. It still is in a way.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think the competition is good. It's healthy. And we have to work. I mean, look, we've grown up with Microsoft, obviously. Google is kind of not brand new for us. I think David showed in the keynote the kind of the history of us with Google. We do a ton of work with Google that I wouldn't say goes unnoticed, but the whole Android ecosystem, what we do with Chrome, and now what we're doing with GCP as well, of course. But I think for the VMware thing is natural for us. We have lots and lots of customers worldwide who use VMware's SDDC or ESX or vSphere, whatever, with the Citrix virtual apps and desktops on top, including integrations with vSAN and so on. So I mean, we've always had a good relationship with VMware, and of course most people know from Twitter that I'm, Sean Bass and I are good friends. So we always try and do what's best for customers, and the announcement that we made this week in terms of VMware Cloud is a natural progression from the on-premises data center to cloud versions of that.
If we keep a bit on competition, do you think there's a difference between competition in the desktop and app virtualization compared to unified workspace competition?
I think, I mean, I think the unified workspace, it's a very nascent market, right? So I think the way that we're trying to position that is much more around an extension of our core capabilities, and of course the acquisition of Sappho was kind of a key part of that. The analytics piece is another key part of that. But yeah, I mean, if you think about the sort of traditional virtual client compute market, there's more competition because it's a more or it's a more well understood market. But yeah, I think even that traditional on-premises market, as you've seen with the announcement of Citrix DAS this week, of course, we understand that there are competitors in cloud, the work that AWS do, but of course we're a great partner with AWS. The work that Nutanix are doing with Frame, yet we're a great partner with Nutanix. So this is a big market, and there's kind of room for everybody.
But if you look at the unified workspace, you're really ahead of the competition at this moment, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. I mean, there are a couple of interesting smaller startups and companies in the unified workspace environment. But I think it's probably one of those markets that the analysts will take a look at in the not so distant future and try and redefine. As we bring in different elements of it, whether that's people analytics or productivity analytics, or whether it's sort of a more focus on integrated security. I think that market in general, if you include desktop as a service as another element of it, I think it probably needs to be rethought because there's so many pieces to a unified workspace, and I think the version 1 of that was done by some of the analysts was good at the time, but you'll see it every day.
It's a developing market, and you don't know where it's going.
Absolutely, and I think it's developing at pace, and there'll be a set of interesting things that play out in that market space. Obviously identity is a big thing. If you look at some of the identity vendors, they're trying to get into more of a workspace world. If you look at some of the content collaboration guys, they're trying to get into a more workspace world. So yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it's a reflection of where the industry is going, and as you said, we'd like to think that we're out in front, but of course we're aware of the competition.
I did the same conversation with Dheeraj Pandey, the CEO of Nutanix, and he said nobody does desktop virtualization better than Nutanix, which I countered with, I don't think the people at Citrix will agree with you. And he said Citrix wants the best on Nutanix. What's your comment?
Well, I don't know about a bit. Well, I think best, it depends how you define best, right? So, we have a good relationship with Dheeraj and his engineering team. There's a couple of guys from Citrix at Nutanix, of course, and that's kind of just the way that the industry works. But yeah, I mean, we've worked with those guys very closely on things like AHV, right? So obviously when they, of course, supporting our own hypervisor on their traditional hardware was the first step, and then our commitment to working with those guys at an engineering level to support AHV. So yeah, I mean, we talk about choice a lot in Citrix, and we kind of mean that. We don't care in the nicest possible way where and what customers choose to deliver their virtual apps and desktops on, whether that's private cloud, whether that's hypervisors, whether that's public cloud infrastructure. Our commitment is to support all of those, as PJ talked about in the keynote. So, and that's a big commitment. It comes with a really big commitment from our engineering guys, and working with the guys like Nutanix is really important. I'm sure they're trying to do their own things with Frame, and
that's one suggest Frame, and they bought Frame. They're becoming an application company a bit more.
Yeah, and it's a very logical thing for those guys to do, and it's I think it's further ratification of the fact that this is a good market space, and of course we've been out in front for a very long time. So we welcome all the competition as long as we can kind of all work together to do what's best for customers. It's fine by me.
Okay, talking about you already mentioned a few cloud partners. You talk a lot about hybrid and multi-cloud, and I think you have partnerships with Google, AWS, Azure. Oracle, I heard somewhere here in
Oracle Cloud,
and maybe even IBM, I don't know, but you have a lot of options.
Yep.
But if I look at the presentation, it's a lot about Google and Microsoft. Can I say that those are the preferred partners, or is that a bridge too far?
No, I don't know about preferred partners. I mean, our commitment to the choice and the public cloud level. Again, the conversation is a little bit different between what I would consider to be let's call it basic for the sake of the conversation, level of support for running Citrix workloads on a public cloud infrastructure. And then you kind of move a little bit further up the stack into hybrid multi-cloud, which really brings in some of the kind of the software-based networking elements, and that's not just SD-WAN, but our software-based ADC, and our own cloud gateway services and so on. It's kind of important that we think about the hybrid multi-cloud from an entire stack perspective, because the more that enterprises deploy components within different clouds, the better it kind of is for us, because we have a solution set that can span all those clouds as part of our definition around choice. So I don't think there's a preferred. I think there are capability sets that our customers or our joint customers look at within public cloud infrastructures for their own strategic reasons. Being able to deploy to any public cloud infrastructure and then deploy networking where that needs to be deployed, deploy security where that needs to be deployed, I think it's a huge advantage for us overall, because of our commitment to making sure that we can support everything the best we can. Now, there are some nuances in the way that public clouds are built. So the way that we leverage certain APIs or the way that we leverage certain core components of infrastructure will always be different, because not all clouds are built the same.
Now, touching on that, you just mentioned that you have one service that offers a single pane of glass to manage all those clouds if you have your apps and desktops running in different environments. I read here a lot about migrating from on-prem to cloud and from cloud to on-prem. Mm-hmm. What I didn't hear was migrating from cloud to cloud. Is that possible? Is that in the works? Can you move a workload from Azure to AWS or to Google or vice versa?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to do it natively, but one of the things. It's not really a use case that we see an awful lot, quite honestly. I think if you go back to the history of cloud, everybody has a slightly different virtualization format. There was never really kind of a unified way to say, look, my virtual machine here, which makes up my, is an atomic element of my overall workload. There was no easy way to say, like, I've got it from on-premises, I want to move it to cloud. I'm going back like 10 years here. Yeah. And then there were some tools that came, and the tools were quite interesting, because when they were first established, it was very much to get it from on-prem into cloud, but there was no way back. So there was there were things out there at the time like OVF as a format that promised a lot, but it's not really a use case that we see an awful lot moving from cloud to cloud. In fact, there's not really a use case that we see an awful lot for migrating things back and forth.
So isn't there a use case in the future when people might choose to, okay, we have now things in Azure and Google and AWS, we're going to scratch one of them and move everything to another, and then it's easier if you can support it.
Yeah, I think if you look at it from a kind of a VM perspective, we will save the container conversation, because I think it's a completely different one in terms of portability and the potential for portability across Kubernetes-based environments is different than what I'm talking about here. So, but I think if you look at it from a is there a trend to want to have portability? Absolutely. Which is why I think if you look at what Microsoft did with Azure Stack, if you look at what AWS did with Outpost, you can kind of see, and of course, VMware doing with VMware Cloud, you can kind of see that as being a natural set of things.
Yeah, but when you deploy it on a public cloud, you use the hypervisor that's running there. You don't push your own.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
that's why it's hard for you to migrate between those clouds.
Yeah, like I say, I mean, it's not the migration thing is not really a use case that we see,
but there are solutions in the market, of course.
There are, yeah, absolutely, and I think that we're kind of, I think we're really focused on making sure that the workloads that customers want to run that are ours work where they need to have them run. Right, the migration pieces and the kind of the other tooling is we've not focused on that so much.
I do want to scratch the container discussion. Do you think that containers can be a solution for this?
I don't know.
For example, are you familiar with Google and
I'm
Anthos?
very familiar with Anthos, yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think it's interesting, if you look at sort of Anthos, the announcement, there was somewhat of how should I say, it was kind of a guarded comment in there that, at some point there may be a mechanism to go, like years ago we had P2V, right? So you could take physical and then make it virtual. There was a question about whether you could have, and I don't know if this is exactly the right nomenclature, but V2C, which is VMs to containers. Yeah. So I don't know how you do that today. I mean,
they announced Anthos Migrate or Migrate Anthos tool, something like that, and
which is the V2C.
Yeah, that should make a VM into a container.
Correct, but there wasn't an awful lot of
information
about that. But it's interesting. I mean, if you think about Google overall, and you look at what happens within Google Cloud, and if you go back to the days of Borg, which was the kind of the magic that ran Google services themselves, it's highly likely that they're sitting on some stuff that they figured out a while back of how to do. Again, this is my supposition.
Yeah, We were in a conversation with Thomas Currian, and the vision there is to get a unified standard for cloud, like we have for the web, that everything can move, and that's what they really want to achieve around us. And if they can make it, and if the migration tool will work, maybe that's for you guys also a solution to move it a bit around.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's a true standard, a W3C standard or whatever, Google are pretty good at that, right? Because they've just done. Oh, they're in the process of doing that with the Quick protocol, which of course was a Google thing. That hopefully becomes ratified as part of HTTP3, which is a completely different conversation. Yeah. But I think if you
and they did the same with HTML in the end. With the Chrome browser, they really pushed.
Yeah, I think.
And everybody got on board. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think HTML5 certainly. Yeah, I mean, I think. Yeah, there's a long way to go in the container space. I think. Obviously Kubernetes seems to have won in terms of the orchestration and management piece. I mean, it makes some sense to run VMs in containers for portability and whatever else, if you can truly abstract where you need to abstract. And then there's also the other question of, the other way around, of what can you do with hypervisors to run containers natively without the need for a VM. Right?
So from a Citrix point of view, you're really following this development and looking for chances to improve.
Absolutely, because I think if you look at if you think about the hybrid multi-cloud strategy a little bit further along, you've got to include cloud native networking in that. So the big difference I would make there is when you think about traditional networking, certainly with the ADC, it's always been kind of a north-south conversation. But now within containers, within the way that container architectures work, there's a lot more east-west traffic. And so obviously the opportunity there for things like ingress controllers and admission controllers and sidecar proxies, and there's a lot in that world which I think is very attractive to us, because we want to continue to evolve the ADC, and then there's a ton of opportunity there, both within the on-premises environment where containers are deployed and managed by Kubernetes, but then also between Kubernetes environments in the same cloud, and then ultimately between Kubernetes environments in different clouds. So I think that's a very appealing proposition, and I think if you look at the investments we're making within the ADM, so lots of opportunity there for security, for orchestration, for portability, for management, for performance. Yeah, it's a really interesting space, but maybe we'll see more about that next Synergy.
Okay, let's move a bit to one of your bigger announcements this week. You just announced the Intelligent Workspace, or at least it's a new code name, I guess, for the Citrix Workspace product, only the next version of it. You can introduce a timeline that we know from social media, only instead of boring us with vacation pictures, you're giving us tasks and notifications that make your work easier. Is that the future of work?
Yeah, so I think it's, if you go back to what we talked about last Synergy, we did a little teaser right at the end of the keynote to talk about how we could do the delivery of information rather than applications, and that information can take many forms, of course. So following Synergy and then sort of leading up to where we introduced the Intelligent Experience. So the Citrix Workspace, then the Intelligent Experience. There's been a lot of work behind the scenes on that. So obviously the acquisition of Sappho was key to that. So the things that you saw in the timeline, for the most part, are driven by the micro apps that are part of the acquisition that we made from Sappho. The second part to that is the productivity analytics piece. So if you think about Workspace overall, the goal that we had, was to really be the preferred way to work for 1 billion people globally. That's our sort of internal, lofty, audacious goal. And to, if you think about just the steps that we have to make to do that, the more that we can get people to use the workspace as the single pane of glass, as you called it, the more we gather in terms of the user transaction data. And the more we gather, the more we can apply our machine learning algorithms, models to that, and the more we understand what's relevant for people. So the relevance thing is a big deal. So if you think about the sort of social media comment, again, it's predicated on a few different things. So a graph will be part of that. So understanding, like in social media, how do I interact with people, and how do I raise the relevancy based on interactions between, effectively nodes or vertices within that graph. The second part of it is obviously the micro apps and sort of delivering those in a just-in-time fashion. And then we've kind of got the core analytics piece, which is working very hard in the background to continually refine how you work. So your model is different than my model. what we do is different. You know, the kind of things that we interact with within the workspace will be different. So there's actually a lot to it. It was a very sort of simple explanation that we gave today, but it's actually been foundational components that we've built over the last year that have really allowed us to announce what we announced. And so, you know, it's great, right? So we teased it last year. We've come on like so far in the last 12 months, and then, you know, as we mentioned on stage, as this becomes generally available later in the year, you know, we're going to ship a bunch of out-of-the-box micro apps, which will obviously reduce the kind of the, you know, the friction for customers to onboard. And then we provide the builder, which I think is really where the magic is. So being able to give an environment where line of business experts.
Yeah, before we go there, how do you think future devices will look? Because if we look at a unified workspace, we're taking away a whole bunch of apps that you don't need anymore. Are we going to thin clients where you just log into a unified workspace?
I mean, I think the unified workspace, so my own vision of that is that, you know, we talked a lot this week about the workspace intelligent experience, but really underneath that is the platform, right? So I think David mentioned it really well in the keynote. He said, you know, we're not building a portal for apps, we're building a platform for work, right? So I think if you take that as a fundamental statement, it's actually super powerful, right? Because although we showed a lot this week of the app itself and the web experience and the mobile experience that PJ showed in his section, I think the big news on that is that when you build a platform, you actually end up with opportunities to have that platform consumed and be consumed by other things, right? So by that I mean, if you think about the platform, so we can consume that in Teams, as we saw. So you can bring things into Teams as part of the Workspace platform. You could also do that through augmented reality, through virtual reality, through the voice assistants, through, you know, the Workspace assistant that we showed. So I think if you think about it from the point of view of like where we're trying to head, we're building a platform that delivers the experience, and that experience really shouldn't matter in terms of being consumed by things like Slack or Teams or Facebook for Work.
But is Windows becoming old then? Are we going to replace Windows in the end? Do we need Windows?
Well, I think it's pretty interesting, isn't it? If you look at, so Windows, if you kind of look at the trajectory of it, it's actually becoming a really important part of Azure, right? So that's kind of more of an interesting thing. Yeah, of course, there's still Windows 10 on the device.
Yeah, but
if you think
we're not really using it if you use a unified workspace.
Well, I mean, if part of that workspace is a virtual app that's hosted on Windows, or it's a VDI, whether it's persistent VDI or whether it's shared pool VDI, then there is a Windows element, of course. But I think if you look at what, you know, Microsoft did with WVD, you know, the announcement that we made for our support of that, plus our own managed desktop, you know, I think of course it's going to be still important because there's lots of use cases that drive it. But
if we look at new generations coming up, they grew up with Android, with iOS.
Yeah, absolutely.
Windows is a very small part of their life, and they demand those simple applications with easy buttons. And
no, I 100%. Yeah, and which is why we showed kind of the easy buttons in the demo, right? And then David's photocopier analogy, which is great, right? So everybody walks up to the photocopier and just presses the green button, right? So yeah, absolutely, Con. You know, I think it's a very natural thing, and it'd be interesting to see, you know, if we have this conversation 5 years from now, how much voice will be the predominant interaction. Because if you look at, I mean, every handset manufacturer plus their platform, you know, obviously plus Google and whatever, have got their, you know, they've got their own integrated voice assistants. So you know, maybe in 5 years from now, we're talking about voice being the way that we consume everything.
Yeah. How fast is the adoption of the Workspace product? Because you introduced it last year and it became widely available.
Yep.
Is the unified Workspace the way forward for most enterprises, or do they still stick a bit on the apps and desktops?
I mean, it's a mix, right? So, you know, if you think about the Workspace, you know, the Workspace V1, as we call it internally, which was the one that we announced last year, huge interest, as you can imagine, from the show last year, and then a steady uptick as customers move to cloud, because a lot of what we showed last year was delivered by Citrix Cloud. So the customers who are moving to cloud, the adoption's great. You know, there's still a long way to go, because enterprise migration to cloud is not a simple construct. So we have a combination of migrations, a combination of net new customers as well, of course. So yeah, I mean, I think that adoption's been great. Again, with the things we showed last year, were you know, being able to sort of aggregate applications and desktops Citrix files, of course, formerly ShareFile, bringing that all into the single pane of glass last year, and then of course this year showing Intelligent Workspace. I mean, I think we're just on a great trajectory, and I think it's really important to remember though the things that we showed within the Intelligent experience doesn't mean the end of being able to deliver virtual apps and desktops in the same view, because they're just another use case within the bigger framework of Workspace.
Do you think the success of the Intelligent Workspace lies within the integrations you can make with third parties?
I think there's a lot of reliance on our own platform, as we talked about, especially analytics. I think once people really understand the value of Citrix Analytics, I think there's going to be a significant it's going to be a significant flywheel for us in the customer uptake. But yeah, I mean, integration's kind of a funny word. We like to talk about things being integrated into the workspace.
Okay.
Which is fine. Yeah, but then you've got you look at the micro apps and the micro workflows. They're a different type of integration.
Yeah.
I keep kind of going back to the point about the builder, but that puts us in a very different customer conversation because of who we would talk to. So line of business people, integration specialists, they're the kinds of people that will need to know the ins and outs of the builder, because they will be the ones who understand which parts of the overall application and or business process need to be brought into the micro workflow framework.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that Citrix is now making its first steps into the low-code market.
Yep.
Because that's how I see it. It's a way of low code, because you created a drag and drop editor for those micro apps to be built, and besides that there was an API for the real developers to plug in as well. Do you have an idea how big your ambition is on low code?
Well, I mean, it's huge. I mean, it's an integral part of the overall strategy to build the micro apps and micro workflows. The reason why we approached it from a low-code, no-code perspective is that the kind of audience that we want to reach are not traditional developers. There may well be cases, and I expect them to be many, where the micro apps and the micro workflows are created by developers, because that's the way organizations are set up. But the analogy I always use is that most organizations have very smart people in the business who are capable of building either an Access database or a complex macro or pivot table in Excel. They're the kinds of people who understand what needs to be done at the business process perspective. So that's who we target. We target them because they're not traditional Citrix buyers. They're the guys who have the needs, the requirements from the line of business perspective. So it helps us to be more. How should I say, relevant in a wider construct.
But should we see it as a feature to improve the Workspace product, or should we see the low-code more as a platform with a lot of expectations for the future?
Yeah.
Are you going after Surface now, or after the Mendixes of this world, or so? How big is the ambition of low-code?
No. So I think if you look at it where we are today, the ambition really is to make sure that we can get a really good builder product out there by the time that we do GA for the Intelligent experience, because we know that organizations have got far more applications than the ones we'll build the micro apps for, out of the box connectors for. So I think we have to have that. Are we going to turn it into a general purpose low code no code platform? I mean, it's probably far too early for us to say that.
But you're not saying it won't be.
Well, I mean, I think we have to see where the market goes, right? Yeah, I mean, I would never say we wouldn't do anything, because if we get the right kind of engagement and the right kind of feedback, then that helps validate our direction. But as we've always done with Citrix, we make acquisitions, we make strategic plays in areas that we think are going to move the needle, and so this is another one. And if you think about what I mentioned before, kind of about integration and workflow, they're massive markets themselves that are being shaken up. And if you think about the robotic process automation market, we're kind of seeing some incredible growth there now from guys like UiPath, Automation Anywhere, Blue Prism, all of which are partners with us. So you can kind of see this sort of natural evolution into, not leaving our traditional partners behind, but maybe strengthening the relationships with new ones because of where the overall workspace market's headed.
Yeah. Now, there's one subject we need to cover. That's your analytics product, because you also announced a big improvement in that. Analytics was basically a security product. You gathered a lot of analytics to improve the security of your platforms. Now you added performance analytics. At least that's coming later this year. Should we see analytics as a starting point, because you just announced in Europe that the control plane is becoming available there.
Yep.
So if enterprise use it, that data stays within the
Yep.
EU. I think that's a
Yep.
big important step for
Absolutely.
them.
Yep.
So should you see this as a starting point, or do you already have a bunch of customers in the EU?
Yeah, so I think we should see analytics as one key leg of the three-legged stool of Citrix, so the workspace, networking, analytics. Now, of course, there's a symbiotic relationship between all three, of course. But I think analytics are, if you kind of think about all historically in Citrix, we've generated lots and lots of event information, right? Logs and performance metrics and counters and all these different things. But they were applied in the context of individual products. So there was, the mass product within Netscaler did networking things. We had EdgeSite that did, and Director that did, XenApps and desktop things. When you build sort of the cloud services and you kind of have a much more unified portfolio, the pieces that we can pick up and make into a bigger set of important analytics across those three areas you talked about, so security, performance and productivity, it's so foundational to Citrix. I mean, I can't stress this enough. We're not talking just about having another mechanism for logging. We're talking about being able to deliver a much more proactive view of security, of performance, or of productivity. So again, I keep coming back to this thing about the user transaction, but yet there are obviously device things that are important, whether that's the endpoint or the network device or whatever. But if you think about it from the bigger picture, the reason why we're doing it ultimately is to be more proactive about delivering security in a different way. So focusing on the user behavior, delivering performance in a different way, understanding the many moving parts between end-to-end application device activities. And then the third one around productivity is, I don't care so much about how long people spend inside an app or inside a virtual desktop or inside a browser session. I want to know why they do that. And the why is important because if you think about what we're doing with the micro apps and micro workflows, the more we understand about what it is that people do, why they do it, the better we can make that experience when we talk about micro apps and micro workflows. So there's an entire loop when we think about this. We always think about analytics in a closed loop. The closed loops are different for the different outcomes. But yeah, it's absolutely foundational to the strategy, and you'll see a lot more investment as we go forward.
The analytics you're gathering for the customers, but do you also get a piece of the analytics for yourself to improve your products or to get insight in what's happening at your customers level?
As part of our customer one, I mean, we're obviously dog food in our own things, of course. But I think maybe more interestingly, if you think about it from the analytics side, what we're doing in the analytics side is a similar platform to what I talked about Workspace. So we want to be able to ingest, let me call it source data from other systems. So Splunk, obviously, is a big one that we see over and over again. The work we've done with Microsoft to engage with the security graph, the things that Brad talked about yesterday around the Intune APIs, Intune controls. So all of those things are super important because no one vendor owns all of it. Right? So I think our notion of building a platform to ingest that data, to add that to the model, it's a very powerful approach. The more data we can bring in from different sources, whether that be through the security graph of Microsoft, which gives us a really good insight into Azure Active Directory usage, as an example. So you think about that, you think about it from Splunk. So Splunk is like hugely rich data sets for most customers because they've invested in it over the last decade. So bringing all that in, through the open platform nature of Citrix Analytics actually gives us a really interesting differentiation, I think, because we're not trying to have a closed environment where we say you can only see and I'll get value from the analytics that we gather. We want to bring as much in as we can.
But do you also see if customers go out of best practices or if they have performance issues within their environments, so you can act on that? So you can call up one of your customers and say, hey, we can see in our data that your environment is not performing very well or is out of best practice. Maybe we can help you improve that. Or
yeah, so we kind of do that today from a Citrix perspective with the health check, of course. But it's kind of a tricky question, right? Because there's obviously application performance management tools that are out there. There's the partnership that we have with Cisco around their tetration analytics. So we don't have an end-to-end view across everything yet. But there certainly would be a good set of use cases to say if we can continue to bring in APM data, we can bring in network level data from existing infrastructures, then absolutely. I mean, it's we can. The world is our oyster in terms of what we can model.
And the customer has the choice which data stays within his environment, which is shared with Citrix in general.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, we don't mandate what customers should do. Again, that's part of the choice. So analytics, that we would hope that the value derived is sufficient that customers will continue to opt in.
Okay. Thank you for this very nice conversation, Christian.
Always a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed the interview. We hope to have a next CEO, CTO, CIO in front of our cameras really, really soon. If you're watching and you're a leader at a tech company, please send us an email because we do want to talk to you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.
Awesome.